From the APREL Bulletin, issue 82, September 2022.
From Rabbit Holes to Holiness by Sister Mary Martin, OP. For people with principles, sticking to definite ideas is often seen as a sign of strength. No self-respecting person wants to be known as fickle, changing his or her views with the wind, which is why we should look with pity on our postmodern society, changing not just ideas and values, but spouses and genders to suit people's whims. There's a sense in which being able to change our ideas easily is actually desirable, even necessary, especially to us as Christians who have to keep using our minds in the pursuit of truth and sanctity. Changing our minds, the need. If we're aware of our fallen nature and are serious about becoming saints, and there's nothing we should be more serious about, then being able to change our minds is actually a non-negotiable. So says St. Paul. Let your minds be remade, and your whole nature thus transformed, then you will be able to discern the will of God. Religious life, being the Christian life lived fully, is a radical commitment to letting the truth remake our minds. There can be no renewal or conversion for us unless our thinking is constantly being cleaned up and straightened out, a process which spiritual theology calls purification of the intellect. It inevitably involves the willing, prompt, and repeated changing of mentality for the better. Then why is it that we often avoid changing our minds? Because it's painful, sometimes excruciatingly so. After his conversion from communism to Christianity, Peter Hitchens, the brother of militant atheist Christopher Hitchens, said that he had thought of writing a book on how to change one's mind, but he decided not to since he knew no one would buy it. Let's be honest, who wants to rid themselves of their deeply held ideas? Humiliation. Our ideas become who we are, as any glance at identity politics will show. Changing them may involve humiliation for starters, and people often prop up their ideas with all sorts of absurdities rather than admit error. For instance, in 2021, we were all told that the COVID vaccines would protect us against the coronavirus and prevent its transmission. Whether they were for the vaccine or had reservations about it, teachers, nurses, construction workers, etc., complied with public health orders mandating vaccinations, and huge numbers fell in with the pro-vax urgings coming from the government and media, all in the interests of preventing transmissions. As the months rolled on, it was clear that the vaccines didn't work. But was there an admission of error? Far from it. The vaccine simply morphed into a drug that mitigated symptoms instead of preventing them. And when that proved untrue, the first 2 doses of the vaccine simply became the necessary first stage in a 4-part process that might even become an annual one. Instead of a humble apology and a liberating reassessment of what could be done instead, there was an absurd moving of the goalposts, a process that is probably far from over. De-stabilisation. In changing our minds, we risk not only humiliation, but also destabilisation. Our worldview can be capsized along with the principles we formerly used to understand reality. What if gender fluidity advocates conceded to biology and recognised 2 sexes only? What if climate change warriors gave up their useless eco-policies? What if COVID were recognised as almost harmless to most of the population? Or turning to the church, what if those in favour of the death penalty nowadays were to discover that St. John Paul, Pope Benedict and Pope Francis were all in agreement about its abolition. What if Catholics who see the Church merely as a government body, and those others who see her utterly corrupted by modernists, could actually see her as manifesting the mind of Christ, guided by the Holy Spirit? What a lot of universes would be destabilized. Rabbit holes. Often, in order to avoid the trauma of humiliation and destabilization, we bolt down any number of rabbit holes rather than simply change our minds. Spiritual theology regards such holes as impediments to the mind's pursuit of truth and holiness. Into the grand silence. This is the first type. Down this rabbit hole we go when, during the course of a disagreement with someone else, our faulty arguments are uncovered. In response, we simply disengage. We become distant from the conversation and move into a self-righteous silence that says, "This conversation is beneath me. I will not continue." Unfortunately, this is a choice for ignorance. We'd rather ignore other views than have our own challenged, even when being instructed or a deeper study could lead us to a better hold on truth. Being willing to be instructed, or being willing to study a question at a deeper level, may or may not demand a change of mind. It may instead shore up our own position, or it may lead us to new horizons of truth. Neither adventure, however, is available to the non-engager who shuts down discussion. For instance, in February 2022, Dr. Peter McCullough, arguably the most published expert on COVID and its treatment, was accused by internet fact-checkers of misinformation regarding his extensive analysis of the COVID vaccine and early treatment of COVID. He challenged any expert as credentialed as he to public discussion to prove his information wrong. But so far he has had no takers. The grand silence. Rabbit hole number 2. Enter the echo chamber. This rabbit hole prevents us from ever having to encounter new ideas, except as straw men. Invoking the straw man fallacy is a surefire way of saving us the trouble of looking seriously at any argument that challenges us. In the echo chamber, we mix only with people who hold the same opinions as we. This means that for years, maybe lifelong, we can live in a safe space in which we never have to change our minds about anything. Following the voices of our chosen bloggers or news channels, for example, we submit ourselves to authorities who sound surprisingly like ourselves. Fed on their prejudices, we listen only to what we want to hear. Spiritual theology categorizes this as the fault, maybe vice, of curiosity. This is not just low-level nosiness, but listening with itching ears only to what delights our desire for the useless, the sensational, and in particular, whatever bolsters or furthers our own pet ideas. We become embroiled in wild guesses, useless nitpicking, polemics, inverted priorities, paranoid interpretations, all of which one cool judgment from a competent authority would settle in a moment, if we were to let it in. Such is the case between Spirit of Vatican II Catholics, sealed in their echo chamber, and Suspectors of Vatican II Catholics, sealed in the other. While they both pontificate about what they think the Council meant, the texts of the Second Vatican Council are left outside the argument, unread and largely unimplemented. Rabbit hole number 3. Rent-a-mob. Here we hide behind others in the rent-a-mob rabbit hole. When we feel conquered in a discussion, instead of giving some credence to the other view, or at least questioning our own, we call for reinforcements, and the more aggressive, the better. Since mobs intimidate by sheer brute force, we can hide behind the vitriol, the bullying tactics, the pot shots of the gang in social media comment boxes or in the stacked numbers at plenary council meetings. Any number of rent-a-mob tactics can let us off the hook from having to look critically at our own position. And so we remain unmoved from our comfortable, superficial reading of situations. After all, the mob is never looked to for a considered opinion. Those clamouring for female deacons at the recent plenary council, for instance, were adamant that their demand was not a grab for power. They then proceeded to bully bishops, stage a public sulk that stopped proceedings, and they claimed they only wanted to be part of the church's decision-making process. Isn't this about having power? They ignored the perennial truth that decisions making a real difference to the church, such as, "Shall I become a saint?" or "How does the Lord want me to live?" don't need any empowerment coming from a plenary council, particularly at the behest of a mob. Rabbit hole number 4. Emotional explosion. This rabbit hole has us dissolve into wordy descriptions of what we feel in order to avoid the logic of a reasoned argument. No one can argue with how we feel or what we've experienced, so somehow we're bailed out of having to deal with facts and evidence or of listening to qualified authorities. Spiritual theology tells us that the obstacles posed by these last two holes are our uncontrolled passions and emotions, which fog our thinking dangerously, making judgments error-prone. Here we simply emote our way out of dealing with truth. Although learning not to be ruled by our feelings takes tough discipline, we can't really call ourselves human if we're not determined to do so. The consequence of emotion rule was clear during the lead-up to and the aftermath of the overturning of Roe v. Wade in the US. No surprises to see pro-abortionists chanting wildly outside the homes of Supreme Court judges or throwing Molotov cocktails into pregnancy help centres after the legislation was overturned. After decades of ungoverned sexual immorality, our culture is filled with spiritually starved souls, angry and violent. The irrational aggression with which people nowadays make their points shows that the truth has become irrelevant and feelings sovereign. Emotion explodes all debate. The Endgame. Not attempting to avoid these intellectual pitfalls of ignorance, prejudice, preoccupation with the trivial, of outsourcing our thinking to the gang, of superficial thinking and emotionalism, will finally warp our minds and fix us in obstinacy, a position rooted in pride. What makes it so difficult for us to submit our egos to the demands of changing our minds is the fact that we don't love truth as much as we think we do. Recognizing the truth can be confronting, demanding that we act against our preferences, even against our convictions, when the evidence shows us that these are off track. Being able to make such a change demands the courage to be humbled and destabilized by this experience. The messages religious life has for changing our minds. Religious life vows a person to living the truth. On this depends how clearly we see Christ. But note, it's religious life itself that does this, not religious themselves. We are as reluctant as anyone else to change our minds, and we can fail to live up to the demands of our vocation. But we also know that the witness to the importance of ongoing conversion to the truth is laid on us in a rather special sense. The Church's liturgical calendar is filled with many religious who did allow truth himself to transform them, a transformation that began with their minds. So how does religious life foster a right functioning of the mind in relation to truth? The vow of poverty. Poverty in spirit is the ultimate goal of the religious vow of evangelical poverty, which is lived in fact. It involves a radical detachment not only from goods, but also from ourselves, including our opinions. If we do have to change our minds, spiritual poverty makes it a lot easier, since by it we take the position of a learner before God's reality. Even learning how to offer opinions in a poor person's way enables us to change them easily if need be, and makes us less likely to descend into the grand silence or hide behind the mob if we discover we're wrong. The vow of chastity. In the Catechism, chastity, especially in thought, is closely connected to love of truth and charity, which makes it easier to love others freely and respect their dignity, especially when they disagree with us. We no longer regard them as the enemy to be cancelled, but as a person with dignity and a fellow pilgrim in search of the truth. Chastity of mind helps us to see the truth more easily and without fear, and this, in turn, helps us resist the explosions of emotion. We've all experienced how difficult it is to discover the truth when we're emoting. The vow of obedience. Obedience to lawful authority makes our minds receptive to guidance or directives, both of which are God's providential way of ensuring our growth and holiness. Those strong and independent types who claim that they don't follow any authority are simply dreaming. Everyone follows authorities, and we're in constant danger of choosing them solely because they think as we do. It's our duty, therefore, to choose our authorities intelligently. We'll be careful in our conversations to cite our authorities, and if we have none, we'll take care not to pit ourselves against impartial experts, or in spiritual matters, against the church. We do not go to the church to find out about things for which the Lord expects us to do our own homework, such as questions of climate change, or the safety of untested medicines, or the effectiveness of mask wearing. However, we'd better listen to her in the areas of her competence. Otherwise, we could find ourselves resisting the voice of God. Heresy, schism, apostasy, and the holding on to convenient lies of all kinds are all rooted in the "I know better" of the proud ego. Obstinacy is always a decision, and its endgame is insanity, which is the blocking out of some important reality. Finally, prayer. Only closeness to God ensures true sanity. It's to this sanity and ultimately sanctity that the whole of religious life is ordered, especially in prolonged prayer and the self-examination it involves. Time with truth himself makes it very difficult to develop the habit of blocking him out, although not impossible. Praying for the gifts of humility, mental purity, and obedience helps us not to focus on the humiliation and de-stabilisation that makes us fear to change our minds. It's a lifelong process of renewal, but it proclaims our dignity before God. The truth himself draws us on. Will we be drawn?